But prior to Carter's watershed 1980 statement, no comparable commitment toward the Islamic world existed, and now that was going to change. Only in retrospect does this become clear, of course. At the time when President Carter declared the Persian Gulf a vital U.S. national security interest, he did not intend to embark upon a war. Nor did President Carter anticipate what course the war was going to follow, its duration, costs, and consequences, much like the European statesman who just over 100 years ago touched off the cataclysm that we know today as the First World War. Carter lit a fuse without knowing where it led. Carter and his adversaries were really clueless as to what lay inside the Pandora's box that they chose to open. But what they and their successors down to the present moment found there prompted them to initiate a series of military actions, some large, some small, that deserve collective recognition as a war. Now, as an American, let me state plainly my own overall assessment of that war. We have not won it. We are not winning it. And simply pressing on is unlikely to produce more positive results next year or the year after. Regarding America's war for the greater Middle East, we can only say one thing with absolute certainty. It will not end anytime soon. It has become self-perpetuating. Now, questions raised by this undertaking will preoccupy and perhaps confound scholars for decades to come, in my view. And in my remarks this evening, I'll limit myself to four of the most fundamental of those questions. First, what motivated the United States to act as it has? Second, what have the civilians responsible for formulating policy and the soldiers charged with implementing policy sought to accomplish? Third, regardless of their intentions, what actually occurred? And fourth, with what consequences? In short, taken together, my remarks will try to link aims to actions to outcomes. Now, the United States embarked upon its war for the greater Middle East in order to preserve the American way of life. The United States embarked upon its war for the greater Middle East in order to assure access to Persian Gulf oil. Both of those statements are true. Back in 1980, the American way of life required bountiful supplies of cheap oil. Even today, whether for good or for ill, that remains the case. But back in 1980, unlike today, the approaching depletion of once plentiful North American oil reserves appeared to be an irreversible fact of life. And the implications of that apparent fact, of course it turned out not to be a fact, the implications of that apparent fact, driven home to the American consumer by the successive oil shocks of the 1970s, had vaulted the Persian Gulf into the first tier of U.S. geopolitical interests. So just as the American Civil War was about slavery, America's war for the greater Middle East from the outset has been about oil. Of course, slavery alone does not define all that divided North and South. At stake was not simply whether people of color would be held in bondage, but which political, economic, and social arrangements were to shape the American future. Similarly, even from the outset, oil alone does not explain what drew the United States militarily into the greater Middle East. At stake was something much more than the commodity that then lubricated the American way of life. At stake were the expectations of limitlessness that many Americans take to be part of their birthright. Recall that during the 1960s and 1970s, the United States had seemingly run headlong into limits. In Vietnam, it encountered a war that it could not win. At home, seemingly in a matter of a few short years, the golden age of post-war prosperity sputtered to an end, leaving Americans to confront low growth, high inflation, and industrial decline. The oil shocks were really the icing on an unwelcome, an unpalatable cake. So the war for the Greater Middle East was one expression of a collective determination to push back against these signs of beleaguerment, to affirm the singularity of the United States as a nation not bound by the constraints that others are obliged to respect. In September 2001, as that conflict was entering its third decade, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld took it upon himself to make explicit the rationale for the war that until that moment had been largely implicit. Speaking with characteristic crispness I should be able to say crisply. Speaking with characteristic crispness at a Pentagon press conference, Rumsfeld explained why the United States had opted for war. We have a choice, he said, either to change the way we live, which is unacceptable, or to change the way that they live. And we chose the latter. Well, 9/11 ends this preliminary phase of America's war for the Greater Middle East. The George W. Bush administration tries to kick things into high gear. Most significantly, kicking into high gear meant invading Iraq. Now, given that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, it's important to understand why the Bush administration made the fateful decision to invade that country in 2003. And I believe it did so in order to validate three precedent-setting and mutually reinforcing propositions. First, the United States was intent on establishing the efficacy of preventive war, of showing that the Bush doctrine articulated by the President in his West Point speech of June 2002 worked. Second, the United States was intent on asserting the prerogative which it would permit to no other country of removing regimes that Washington considered odious. And finally, the purpose of invading Iraq was to begin reversing the practice of exempting the Islamic world from what we might call neoliberal standards, demonstrating that what National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice called, quote, the paradigm of progress, by which she meant democracy, limited government, market economics, and respect for human rights, especially women's rights, that this paradigm of progress, also called the Freedom Agenda, was as applicable to the Greater Middle East as it was to the rest of the world. And here, when you think about those three notions, proving that preventive war works, claiming the prerogative of overthrowing odious regimes, imparting neoliberal standards on societies that previously had resisted them. What we've got here really is, in concrete and specific terms, a strategy to change the way they live, referring to Rumsfeld's comment. Now, as a venue to begin implementing that strategy, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, situated at the very core of the Greater Middle East, appeared uniquely attractive. After all, Saddam had made his country an international pariah, virtually without allies or even sympathizers. No one was going to mourn his forceful removal from the scene. Further, the Iraqi army really was not likely to pose significant opposition, having amply demonstrated its incompetence, even before taking into account the effects of periodic U.S. bombing during the 1990s, along with a decade of crippling sanctions. That the Iraqi people were largely secular, upwardly mobile, and united in their yearning for liberation, a fanciful image nursed within the upper reaches of the Bush administration, that figured as a bonus. In other words, what made it imperative to invade Iraq was not the danger that Iraq posed, but the opportunity that Iraq presented. Try this thought experiment. Imagine that President Bush's famous mission accomplished speech of May 1st, 2003, declaring that, quote, major combat operations have ended. Imagine that that had proven accurate. Imagine that Vice President Cheney's prediction of U.S. forces being greeted as liberators, another quote. Imagine that that had held. Imagine that Rumsfeld's projections of total war costs coming in at, quote, something under $50 billion had turned out to be correct. Imagine that Paul Wolfowitz's estimate of Iraq being able to, quote, finance its own costs of reconstruction. Imagine that that had panned out. Imagine that Undersecretary of Defense Douglas Feith's promise of the U.S. military action, quote, putting Iraq on a path to become a prosperous and free country. Imagine that that had come to fruition. Imagine, in short, that Operation Iraqi Freedom had played out as the Bush administration expected it to play out. How would such an outcome have affected America's standing in the greater Middle East?